It is the early afternoon of July 2nd, 1944, somewhere over Romania, and the sky above the Ploiești oil fields is on fire. Black smoke columns rise 11,000 feet into the air, thick enough to blot out the sun, thick enough that bomber crews say you can smell the burning crude oil through your oxygen mask. Engines scream in formation. Flak bursts pepper the sky in dirty gray-black puffs, one after another, the percussion of war. Somewhere in that chaos, a long-range American fighter, sleek, fast, painted with white invasion stripes, peels away from a bomber formation and has just defended, its job done, its fuel running low. It is a North American P-51 Mustang, and on this day, fate has something unusual in store for it. This is the story of how that machine, the airplane that would end up breaking the back of the German Luftwaffe, fell almost by accident into German hands, and how the men who examined it walked away not just impressed, but deeply unsettled. Because what they found inside that cockpit wasn't just a fast airplane. It was proof that the war in the air had already been decided. They just didn't know it yet. To understand why a single captured fighter could shake the confidence of an entire air force, you have to go back further, back to the skies over Schweinfurt, back to the autumn of 1943, when American daylight bombing over Germany was, by every honest measure, failing. By late 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had committed itself to a doctrine that sounded brilliant on paper and proved murderous in practice. Send heavily armed four-engine bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators, deep into German territory in daylight, flying in tight defensive boxes, trusting that their combined firepower could fight off enemy fighters without an escort. The theory was that the bomber, bristling with up to 13 machine guns, was its own best defense. Historical accounts from surviving aircrew tell a different story. On October 14, 1943, a mission airman would later call Black Thursday, 291 B-17 set out to strike the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. 60 bombers did not return. 17 more were so badly damaged they were scrapped. Over 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. Picture it. Picture the inside of a B-17 at 25,000 feet, the temperature outside the aircraft plunging to 50 degrees below zero. Picture young men, many barely out of their teens, wedged into gun turrets, their breath freezing on their oxygen masks, watching German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, come screaming through the formation in head-on attacks because that was the one place the bombers' defensive guns were weakest. Picture watching the aircraft next to you take a direct flak hit and simply disappear in a flash of orange and black, and counting quietly, instinctively, how many parachutes come out before it falls. This was the reality of the air war over the Reich. The bombers could reach the target, but the cost of reaching it was becoming unsustainable. German fighter pilots understood this with brutal clarity. Their tactic was simple and devastatingly effective. Wait for the American Escort fighters, the short-legged Spitfires and P-47 Thunderbolts, to reach the limit of their fuel range and turn back toward England. Then attack, deep into Germany, past Aachen, past the Rhine, anywhere beyond roughly 200 miles from the English coast. The bombers flew utterly alone. No Escort fighter of 1943 had the legs to go all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe didn't need to win every fight. They just needed to wait for the moment the bombers were undefended, and the math would do the rest. This was the central problem haunting Allied air planners in the winter of 1943. How do you protect a bomber for 1,000 miles over hostile territory when no fighter build can carry enough fuel to make the trip? The answer had actually existed for months, quietly, almost by accident, in a fighter that almost wasn't built for this war at all. The P-51 Mustang began its life not as an American triumph, but as a British solution to a British problem. In early 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation in California and asked them to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license for the Royal Air Force. North American's president, Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold counteroffer instead. Give us 120 days, and we'll design you something better from scratch. Historical accounts suggest the prototype airframe, the NA-73X, was completed in roughly 117 days, an almost unbelievable engineering sprint. The aircraft that emerged was aerodynamically advanced for its era, featuring a then-revolutionary laminar flow, wing designed to reduce drag, and a fuselage shape that let it slip through the air with remarkable efficiency. But there was a problem. The early Mustangs, designated P-51A, and the Allison engine variants, the RAF, called Mustang Mark I, were fitted with the Allison V1710 engine, a power plant that performed beautifully at low altitude, but lost significant power above 15,000 feet, exactly the altitude where the brutal high-stakes battles over Germany were being fought. The RAF found the early Mustang excellent for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack. But as a high-altitude bomber escort, it simply couldn't compete. And then came a marriage that changed everything. In April 1942, a small group of Royal Air Force test pilots, Ronald Harker among them, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew the Allison engine Mustang and recognized something the Americans hadn't fully appreciated. This airframe was exceptional. The drag was low. The handling was clean. If you could give it an engine that didn't fall off a cliff at altitude, you might have something extraordinary. Rolls-Royce began experimenting with fitting the Mustang airframe with their Merlin 61 engine, the same supercharged power plant that gave the Spitfire Mark IX its high-altitude bite. The results, according to historical flight test records, were staggering. The Merlin-powered Mustang could now fight effectively above 30,000 feet, with a dramatic increase in speed and climb performance at altitude. North American Aviation, working with Packard, which would manufacture the Merlin engine under license in the United States, rushed the new variant into production. It was designated the P-51B, and soon after, the definitive P-51D, recognizable by its bubble canopy offering nearly unbroken visibility in every direction. A feature pilots would later say felt like sitting in the open sky itself, rather than inside a machine. But engine power alone didn't solve the range problem. Altitude performance meant nothing if the airplane still couldn't fly to Berlin and back. The true breakthrough, the one that would decide the air war, was almost mundane by comparison. Drop tanks, disposable external fuel tanks, mounted under each wing, that the pilot could jettison the instant they ran dry or the instant enemy fighters appeared. Picture the visual now. Long lines of P-51s climbing out over the English Channel, two teardrop-shaped tanks slung beneath their wings like extra lungs, carrying the fuel that would let them fly far beyond what their internal tanks alone ever could. With these external tanks, combined with an enlarged internal fuselage fuel tank added to later production blocks, the P-51D's range stretched to roughly 1,650 miles on internal and external fuel combined. Enough for the first time in the war to escort bombers not just to the German border, but deep into the heart of the Reich, to Berlin, to Munich, to anywhere the bombers needed to go. And then, at the moment combat began, came the maneuver that bomber crews would remember for the rest of their lives. The drop tanks separating from the wings, tumbling away into empty air, the Mustangs suddenly lighter, suddenly faster, suddenly ready to fight. Gun camera footage and pilot reports from the period describe this instant. The tanks falling away, almost as a ritual. It meant the Escort had arrived for real. It meant, for the bomber crews staring out through frosted gun turret glass, that they were no longer alone. This is the moment that changed the entire character of the air war, and German pilots felt it happen in real time, in the worst possible way. Beginning in early 1944, under the command of Lieutenant General James Doolittle, already a legend from his 1942 raid on Tokyo, now commanding the U.S. 8th Air Force, American escort tactics underwent a radical transformation. Previously, escort fighters had been ordered to stay close to the bombers, a defensive leash that limited their effectiveness. Doolittle changed the order. Let the fighters range ahead, hunt the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground, engage on their own terms. The Mustang, with its long legs and its high-altitude Merlin engine, was now free to do what it did best: find German fighters before they ever reached the bomber stream, and destroy them. For the German pilots' flying defense of the Reich, the famous Reichsverteidigung, this was the moment the war in the air began to feel unwinnable. Historical accounts from Luftwaffe veterans describe a creeping, dreadful realization through the winter and spring of 1944. The Escort fighters were no longer turning back at the German border. They were everywhere, over Berlin, over Munich, waiting, high above, with the sun at their backs. It was into this exact moment of growing German anxiety that fate placed a nearly intact P-51 Mustang directly into Luftwaffe hands. The exact details of how individual Mustangs fell into German possession vary across the war. Some force-landed with mechanical failure. Some were shot down with their pilots captured and the airframe largely intact. Some were recovered from crash sites and painstakingly repaired. Historical accounts confirm that by 1944, the Luftwaffe's testing unit for captured enemy aircraft, based primarily at Rechlin, the Central German Military Aviation Test Center north of Berlin, had at least one airworthy P-51 Mustang in its possession, alongside other captured American and British types. The pilot most closely associated with conducting these test flights, according to historical record, was Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lurk, a Luftwaffe test pilot whose job was to fly captured Allied aircraft, evaluate their true capabilities, and report back on how German fighters could counter them in combat. Picture that hangar at Rechlin. Picture German ground crews. Men who had spent years working on Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Men who understood German engineering intimately, walking slowly around this captured American fighter, running their hands along its unfamiliar fuselage lines, peering into a cockpit built an ocean away. There would have been a strange, uneasy curiosity in that hangar. This was not a trophy. It was an opportunity to understand the enemy from the inside. And as the engineers and the test pilot began their work, what they found was not what they expected. The laminar flow wing was the first surprise. German aerodynamicists had experimented with similar concepts, but seeing it executed at this scale in a mass-produced fighter was different. The wing's smooth profile, designed to delay the onset of turbulent airflow and reduce drag, meant the Mustang could slice through the air with a fuel efficiency that German fighters of comparable power simply could not match. This wasn't just a fast airplane. It was an airplane engineered, from the very shape of its wings, to fly far. Then came the fuel system itself, the internal fuselage tank, the external drop tank plumbing, the sheer total capacity dedicated to range rather than raw speed or climb. 4 German pilots accustomed to the Bf 109, an outstanding dogfighter, but one notoriously limited by its small internal fuel capacity. Historical accounts and contemporary technical assessments note that standard 109 variants carried barely enough fuel for about an hour of combat radius without external tanks. The Mustang's range was almost difficult to process. This was an airplane that could take off in England, fly across the North Sea, cross the entire width of occupied Europe, fight a sustained air battle over the German capital, and still have enough fuel to fly home. No German fighter, not the 109, not the FW-190, was designed to do anything close to that. And then there was the engine, the Packard-built Merlin, with its 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger, engineered specifically to maintain power at the altitudes where the bombers flew and the air battles raged, above 25,000 feet. German test pilots, evaluating the aircraft's climb and high-altitude performance, would have recognized immediately what this meant in combat terms. At the altitudes where it mattered most, the Mustang did not fade. It held its power. It held its speed. It held its bite. But what reportedly struck Lurk and his fellow evaluators just as much as the technical specifications was something harder to quantify: the airplane's balance. Pilot reports and post-war interviews described the P-51 as remarkably forgiving and stable for a high-performance fighter, responsive in the controls without being twitchy, capable of sustained high-G maneuvering without snapping into a dangerous stall, and offering, through that bubble canopy, visibility that German pilots, accustomed to the heavier framed canopies of the 109 and 190, found genuinely startling. In a dogfight, visibility is survival. A pilot who can see an enemy a half-second sooner often lives. A pilot who can't often doesn't. Put together, the picture that emerged from Rechlin was not the picture German high command wanted to hear. This was not a lucky design. This was not a stopgap fighter rushed into service. This was a fully realized weapons system. Speed, range, altitude performance, visibility, and stability, built for exactly the mission that was now strangling the Luftwaffe to death over its own cities. The reports flowing out of the German test and evaluation program made clear that there was no easy technical countermeasure. You could not simply outdesign this problem away in a few months. The Mustang did not have a single fatal weakness to exploit. It was, by the brutal standard of total war, simply better suited to its mission than anything Germany had to throw against it in the same role. This realization mattered enormously, because it landed at the exact moment when Germany's strategic position in the air was already collapsing. Through the spring of 1944, in the lead-up to the Normandy invasion, the U.S. 8th Air Force and the Royal Air Force intensified the campaign against the Luftwaffe directly, a period airmen and historians alike would later call Big Week, and the months that followed, a sustained effort not just to bomb German industry, but to force the Luftwaffe's remaining fighters into the air and destroy them there. Pilots and machines together, in numbers Germany could not replace. The P-51 Mustang was the blade at the center of this strategy. Where it had once been impossible to protect bombers all the way to a target and back, now German fighter pilots faced a terrible new reality. There was no sanctuary altitude, no safe distance from the coast, no moment in the mission profile where they could count on facing bombers alone. Consider the human cost on the German side of this equation, because this is not a story that should be told only in numbers and airframes. The Luftwaffe by 1944 was suffering catastrophic, unsustainable losses among its most experienced fighter pilots. Men with years of combat experience, men who had flown over Poland, over France, over the Eastern Front, irreplaceable not because of equipment, but because of the thousands of flight hours and hard-won instincts that cannot be manufactured on a production line the way an airframe can. Germany could still, even late in the war, build fighter aircraft in significant numbers. What it could no longer do was train pilots fast enough or keep its experienced veterans alive long enough to match the relentless grinding pressure the Mustang and its fellow long-range escorts applied, day after day, mission after mission. Historical accounts describe German training programs shortened drastically to push replacement pilots into combat faster. Young men, with a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had, sent up against opponents who, by this point in the war, often had more combat experience and better maintained, better fueled, better supplied aircraft underneath them. Imagine being one of those young replacement pilots, 18 or 19 years old, climbing into the cockpit of a Bf-109 in the summer of 1944, knowing, because everyone in your squadron knew by then, that the silver fighters with the checkerboard or red noses, the ones with the long, slender drop tanks, would be waiting somewhere above you hidden in the sun with more fuel, more experience, and more altitude than you had. That fear was not abstract. It shaped how the Luftwaffe fought, where it could risk engaging, and ultimately how fast it bled out. And this is precisely the strategic truth that the captured Mustang at Rechlin confirmed in hard technical detail. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't simply being outnumbered. Germany was facing an opponent whose central weapon, this airplane, had been engineered, almost serendipitously, through a British test pilot's instinct, an American airframe's clean aerodynamics, and a legendary British engine, into the single most effective bomber escort fighter of the entire war. There was no easy fix. No quick tactical adjustment was going to undo a fundamental gap in range, altitude performance, and pilot visibility that had been built into the machine itself. By the autumn of 1944, the numbers told the story the Rechlin evaluation had already warned about. Allied air superiority over Western Europe, and increasingly over German skies themselves, was no longer contested in any meaningful sense for sustained periods. Bomber formations that had once fought desperately for every mile now frequently completed deep penetration raids with Escort cover the entire way, there and back. The Luftwaffe still fought, fiercely, sometimes with stunning tactical skill from its remaining veteran pilots. And new German jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 would briefly demonstrate just how far ahead German engineering could leap when given the chance. But the broader campaign of attrition had already done its damage. There were not enough trained pilots left, and not enough opportunities to engage on favorable terms, to reverse what the Mustang and the long-range Escort campaign had set in motion. Picture the late stages of this story from above the clouds, in the cockpit of an American bomber crew, flying yet another deep mission into Germany in the final months of 1944. The fear is still there. Flak never stopped being terrifying, and no Escort fighter could make a flak burst miss. But something has changed in the texture of the mission. Pilots and crews who flew through 1943's Black Thursday and lived to fly again in late 1944 described, in post-war interviews and memoirs, a different feeling entirely. Looking up and seeing the silver shapes of P-51s weaving high above the formation, the contrails crossing the sky like a protective net, and feeling, for the first time in the war, something close to safety. Not certainty, never certainty, but a fighting chance that simply hadn't existed 2 years earlier. That is the quiet, human core of this story. An airplane is steel and aluminum and fuel and rivets. But what the Mustang actually delivered in the cockpits of the bomber crews it protected was something closer to hope. The difference between a mission that might end in death over German soil and a mission with a real chance of getting every man home. And on the other side of that same airplane, in the cockpits of young German pilots watching their fuel gauges and their squadron numbers shrink together, it delivered something closer to dread. The slow, grinding realization that the machine they could not outfly, could not outclimb, and increasingly could not even outsee, was always going to be there, waiting, no matter how far they flew, to escape it. There is another layer to this story worth sitting with, because it explains why German engineers, for all their talent, could not simply copy their way out of the problem. Germany was not short on aerodynamic genius in 1944. German wind tunnel research, German jet propulsion work, German rocket-assisted interceptor programs, all of it stood at or near the cutting edge of aviation science. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, could outrun a Mustang by well over 100 miles an hour in level flight. On paper, Germany still had answers. But paper does not fly missions. By late 1944, German industry was operating under relentless Allied bombing of its own fuel refineries and rail networks. The same long-range bomber campaign the Mustang now protected, which meant that even when extraordinary aircraft like the Me-262 reached frontline squadrons, there was often not enough refined aviation fuel to train pilots properly or fly them in the numbers needed to matter. Historical accounts describe Luftwaffe jet units grounded for days at a time, simply waiting for fuel deliveries that never fully arrived. The Mustang and the long-range bomber campaign it escorted had created a strangling feedback loop. Bombers hit the oil refineries. Fighters protected the bombers that hit the oil refineries, and the resulting fuel shortage crippled the very jet aircraft that might have challenged the Mustang's dominance. Engineering brilliance, in other words, was no longer enough. Germany needed fuel, trained pilots, and time. And by the autumn of 1944, the air war itself had made sure there was almost none of any of the three left. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the simple version of events, the version that treats air superiority as something won purely through dogfights and kill counts. The truth, confirmed by the very evaluation reports German test pilots filed after flying the capture Mustang, was systemic. It wasn't just that the P-51 could outturn or outclimb a 109 in any single engagement. Pilot skill and tactical positioning still mattered enormously in individual fights, and plenty of experienced German pilots scored victories against Mustangs right up until the war's final weeks. What the Mustang did, structurally, was remove Germany's last sanctuary. There was no longer a safe altitude, no longer a safe distance from the coast, no longer a moment in a mission profile, anywhere over the Reich, where a German pilot could assume the skies above him were empty. That psychological weight multiplied across hundreds of sorties and thousands of young pilots. did something that no single dogfight ever could. It broke the sustainability of the entire defensive system. Consider, too, the sheer scale of industrial commitment this required from the American side, because the Mustang's dominance was never only about one airplane's design. It was about what happened when that design met the full weight of wartime mass production. North American Aviation's plants in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, turned out P-51s at a pace that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, with total wartime Mustang production eventually reaching more than 15,000 aircraft across all variants. Each one needed a trained pilot behind the stick, a maintenance crew keeping it airworthy on muddy English airfields, armorers loading its 6 wing-mounted 50-caliber machine guns, and a logistics chain stretching back across the Atlantic to keep aviation fuel, ammunition, and spare Merlin engines flowing without interruption. This was the other half of the equation that the German evaluators at Rechlin could not fix with any report, however accurate. You cannot out-engineer an opponent's production capacity. Even a perfect countermeasure, discovered in a hangar in 1944, would have taken precious months to design, test, and manufacture at scale. Months Germany's collapsing industrial base and fuel supply simply did not have. Thing too about the airfields themselves, scattered across the English countryside. Places like Boxted, Debden, and Steeple Morden, muddy grass and steel mat runways carved into farmland, where ground crews worked through the night in the cold to ready Mustangs for dawn missions. Picture the routine that became almost sacred to these airmen. Pre-dawn briefings lit by hooded lamps, navigators tracing pencil lines across maps of Germany, pilots pulling on fleece-lined flight jackets against the bitter cold of high-altitude flight, the smell of aviation fuel and gun oil thick in the morning air. Then the climb into the cockpit, the cough and roar of the Merlin engine catching, propeller blades blurring into invisible discs, and one by one, fighters rolling down the runway into gray English skies, climbing to rendezvous with bomber formations already forming up at altitude. Every mission carried the same quiet, unspoken arithmetic: enough fuel to get there, enough fuel to fight, enough fuel to get home. The Mustang pilots lived by that arithmetic every single day, and it was precisely that arithmetic, refined, expanded, and protected by drop tanks and a bigger internal tank, that the captured aircraft at Rechlin laid bare to its German evaluators in cold, undeniable numbers. And what of the pilots who flew the Mustang itself? The young Americans entrusted with this machine that had become, almost without anyone fully realizing it in real time, the most important fighter in the European theater. Many were barely 20 years old, trained in a matter of months on a continent away from home, thrown into combat against opponents who, in many cases, had been flying and fighting since before these American pilots had finished high school. Historical accounts and memoirs from 8th Air Force veterans describe a strange duality in flying the Mustang, a machine that felt, in the air, remarkably forgiving and confidence-inspiring, light on the controls, honest in a stall, with that astonishing bubble canopy visibility that let a pilot see almost the entire sky around him, and yet a mission profile that remained relentlessly dangerous, hour after hour, deep in a territory where capture or death waited for any engine failure, any navigation error, any moment of bad luck. The machine gave them an edge. It never gave them safety. Pilots still died. Pilots still came home shaking, unable to eat, staring at empty bunks where a friend had slept the night before. The Mustang changed the odds of the air war. It did not erase the war's cost. That duality is worth holding on to, because it cuts against the tempting, simpler version of this story, the version where one brilliant airplane simply wins a war by existing. The Mustang did not win the war alone. It did not even win the air war alone. It fought alongside the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, RAF Spitfires and Typhoons, and the overwhelming weight of Allied industrial production. What the Mustang did, uniquely, was solve the one problem that had been quietly strangling the entire Allied daylight bombing strategy since 1942, the problem of distance, of being able to protect the bombers not for part of the journey, but for all of it. That single capability, born from a British engine swap and an American fuel tank redesign, turned out to be the structural key that unlocked everything else. And when German test pilots sat in that captured cockpit at Rechlin, running their hands over its controls, checking its fuel system, studying its supercharger, they were, whether they used this language or not, looking directly at the solution to the problem that was about to cost their Air Force everything. When Hans Werner Lerck and his fellow test pilots climbed out of that captured Mustang's cockpit at Rechlin, they were not just filing a technical report. They were, in effect, looking directly at the architecture of their own defeat in the skies over the Reich, engineered not from any single stroke of genius, but from a chain of decisions, a British purchasing request, an American design sprint, a British test pilot's instinct about an underpowered airframe, a legendary engine transplant, and finally, the unglamorous, almost overlooked addition of bigger fuel tanks. None of those individual choices were dramatic on their own. Together, they built the airplane that ended Germany's ability to defend its own skies in daylight. The P-51 Mustang would go on to fly with nearly every major Allied air force by war's end, would be credited with destroying more enemy aircraft in the European theater than any other Allied fighter, and would remain in service with air forces around the world for years after the guns over Europe finally fell silent. But its real legacy isn't measured only in kill totals or production numbers. It's measured in the bomber crews who finished their tours and went home because an Escort fighter could finally go where they needed to go. It's measured in the strategic truth, confirmed inadvertently by the enemy's own test pilots in a hangar at Rechlin, that the war in the air over Germany had already turned. Not because of any single battle, but because of an airplane that could simply fly farther, fight higher, and see clearer than anything sent up against it. War, in the end, is rarely decided by a single dramatic moment. It is decided in increments, in fuel tank capacity, in supercharger stages, in the width of a canopy frame, in 1,000 small engineering choices that add up, quietly, into the difference between life and death for the men flying through the fire. The German pilots who studied that captured Mustang at Rechlin understood this better than almost anyone. They had built one of history's most feared air forces, flown by some of the most skilled fighter pilots the world had ever seen. And in that cockpit, examining an airplane built an ocean away by people solving an entirely different problem, they found the quiet, undeniable proof that the balance had shifted, and that no amount of skill or courage left in their cockpits could fully turn it back.